A woman is shouting in the middle of a crowded street, and almost nobody stops walking. She is not on a stage. She is not hiding in a temple, waiting for the right people to come find her. She has planted herself at the noisiest intersection in the city gates, the place where merchants haggle and soldiers pass through, and news gets shouted from one stall to the next, and she is calling out at the top of her voice. You would think a scene like that would stop traffic. Instead, most people walk past her the way you walk past a car alarm. Background noise. Somebody else's problem. Here is what almost nobody watching this video will tell you they've done this week. Ignored a warning because it was inconvenient. Kept scrolling past something true because stopping would have cost them something. That's not a guess about you. That's the oldest habit in the human race, and it's exactly what this chapter was written to interrupt. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to know exactly who she is, why she is shouting, and what happens on the day she finally stops. This is not a poem about a real woman. This is not a stray character wandering into an ancient story. This is not decoration. This is the first chapter of the Book of Proverbs, and it is, without much exaggeration, the key that unlocks all 31 chapters that come after it. Here's what most people miss about Proverbs. You open your Bible, you flip to it, expecting a long list of one-line sayings, work hard, don't be lazy, watch your mouth. And you skim right past chapter 1 to get to the real Proverbs later. But chapter 1 is not a warm-up. It is the operating system the other 30 chapters run on. Skip it, and the rest of the book turns into good advice with no foundation under it. Read it closely, and you start to notice something remarkable. The man who wrote this book planted a single sentence in verse 7, repeated it almost word for word in chapter 9, and then closed the entire book with the same idea one more time in the final chapter. That is not an accident. That is a signature, stamped on the front door and the back door of the house, so you can't leave without walking past it twice. You are about to see exactly how that signature works and exactly who that shouting woman is. Let's start with who is writing. The book opens by naming its author, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. If you know anything about Solomon, you probably know him as the richest king in Israel's history, or the man who built the temple, or the man in the story about 2 women and a baby, cutting through a lie with a single, terrifying proposal. But before any of that, there's an earlier scene, the one that actually explains where all this wisdom came from. Early in his reign, God appears to Solomon in a dream at a place called Gibeon and offers him, essentially, a blank check. Ask for anything. And Solomon, a young king who has just inherited a kingdom he's not sure he can run, doesn't ask for wealth. He doesn't ask for a long life. He doesn't ask for his enemies destroyed. He asks for what the text calls a hearing heart, the ability to actually understand what he's looking at, to tell good from evil when the moment comes and it matters. God is so pleased with the request that he gives Solomon the wisdom and the riches and the long life he never asked for. That request is the hinge the entire Book of Proverbs swings on. This is a king who once had the chance to ask for anything in the world and chose understanding instead. Picture the position Solomon was actually in. He was young. His father David, the shepherd-turned-king who had united the tribes and fought off Israel's enemies for decades, was gone. The throne Solomon inherited was surrounded by rival claimants, foreign powers watching for weakness, and a nation that had never seen him lead anything. Any king in that position could be forgiven for asking God to simply remove the danger wealth to buy loyalty, an army to crush his enemies, a long life to outlast every rival waiting for him to fail. Instead, in the middle of the night, in a dream at Gibeon, he asks God for something almost nobody in his position would think to ask for, the ability to actually tell the difference between good and evil when the moment came and the stakes were real. That single choice, made once, in private, before he had built a single wall of the temple or written a single line of this book, is the reason everything that follows carries any weight at all. So when Solomon writes, in verse 2, that this book exists so that people may know wisdom and discipline, he is writing from the inside of that story. He knows what it cost to get it, and he knows what he almost missed. The Hebrew word behind wisdom here is Chokmah, and this is where the chapter starts working differently than you might expect. Chokmah is not primarily about being clever. It's not trivia, and it's not IQ. The same Hebrew word is used just a few books earlier for the craftsman Bezalel, the man God filled with his spirit to design and build the furnishings of the tabernacle, the gold, the fabric, the intricate joinery. Chokmah is skill. It's the difference between someone who knows facts about carpentry and someone who can actually build something that holds together and lasts. Solomon is telling you, in the very first sentence, that this book is not a collection of clever remarks. It's a craftsman's manual for building a life that doesn't collapse under pressure. Paired with Chokmah is a second Hebrew word, musar, usually translated discipline or instruction. Musar carries an edge. Chokmah doesn't. It's the word for correction, sometimes painful correction, the kind a craftsman applies to a piece of wood that's warping in the wrong direction. Centuries later, a whole movement of Jewish ethical teaching in Lithuania would take its name directly from this one word, back in the second verse of this very chapter, because the people who study this book most closely have always understood that wisdom in the Bible is never separate from correction. You don't get Chokmah without Musar. You don't get the skill without the discipline that shapes it. And this is where it gets remarkable. After Solomon lists 4 purposes for the book in verses 2 through 6, wisdom, discipline, understanding, and skill in righteous living, he stops. And in verse 7, he tells you the one thing everything else depends on. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That's it. That's the sentence the entire book is built on top of. And if you're hearing the word fear and picturing terror, cowering, dread, the kind of fear that makes you want to run, you are about to misunderstand the most important verse in the book. The Hebrew word is yirah, and it does not mean cowering. It means weighted reverence. It's the fear you feel standing at the edge of something enormous, the ocean at night, a mountain range, the sheer scale of something that is bigger and older and more real than you are. It's not a fear that makes you run away. It's a fear that makes you stand up a little straighter, go quiet, and pay attention. Yirah is what you feel in the presence of something you cannot control and would not want to. Here's what most translations don't show you clearly. This exact formula, the fear of the Lord, is the beginning of wisdom, doesn't appear just once in Scripture. Job asks, in one of the oldest and strangest chapters in the Bible, where wisdom can actually be found. He searches the mines, the depths of the sea, the land of the living, and comes up empty every time. And then Job lands on the same answer Solomon gives here. The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. 2 very different books, written in very different situations, both circling back to the identical conclusion. When 2 witnesses that far apart in the Bible say the same thing independently, that is not coincidence. That is the whole book pointing at one door and saying, this is the only way in. Solomon puts that door at the front of his book in verse 7. And then, like any writer who wants you to remember something, he says it again. Chapter 9, closing out the section written specifically to a son. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And when you get all the way to chapter 31, the famous closing poem about a woman of noble character, the very last line of the entire book circles back one final time. A woman who fears the Lord, she is the one to be praised. Beginning, middle, end. The same idea, planted 3 times like a stake, driven through the whole structure so nothing shifts. Once you see that pattern, you cannot unsee it. Every proverb about money, marriage, anger, and laziness that comes after chapter 1 is standing on this one foundation, whether the text says so out loud or not. Now here's where the tone of the chapter changes completely, and where you start to feel the weight of what's actually at stake. In verse 8, the voice in the text shifts. It's no longer Solomon addressing you in general. It becomes intensely personal, a father speaking directly to his son, the way David must have once spoken to a young Solomon. Hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the teaching of your mother. And then, immediately, the reason for the warning becomes clear. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. What follows is not abstract. It's a scene. A gang of men, the text doesn't soften them, inviting a young man to join them in ambushing someone innocent purely for the plunder. Let us lay wait for blood. Let us lurk privily for the innocent without cause. We shall find all precious substance. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Listen to how they're selling it. Not, let's do something evil. Easy money, fast riches. belong to us, and you'll never have to work for it. That is one of the oldest recruiting pitches in human history. And you have heard some version of it in your own life. Maybe not men waiting in an alley, but a shortcut that promised something for nothing, dressed up to look harmless. Notice what the father does not do here. He does not simply forbid his son from going. He does not say, "Because I said so," and leave it there. He walks the boy through the entire scene in advance, who will approach him, what they'll promise, how good it will sound in the moment, so that when the invitation actually comes, it will feel familiar instead of tempting. That's a specific kind of love. It's the love of someone who has already seen how this story ends and is trying, with everything he has, to get his son to skip the middle of it. And this is the part of the chapter that should genuinely unsettle you. Solomon doesn't just warn the son that this path is wrong. He shows him, in a single devastating image, that the trap these men set for someone else ends up closing on them. They lay wait for their own blood. They lurk privily for their own lives. So are the ways of everyone that is greedy of gain, which taketh away the life of the owners thereof. The predator becomes the prey of his own scheme. The net he builds to catch someone else eventually swallows him. That's not poetic justice tacked on afterward. That's how the trap was built from the beginning. Sin does not just cost the person it's aimed at, it costs the one who set it. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, describes just how far Solomon's reputation for this kind of discernment traveled kings and rulers from distant lands, sending envoys with riddles and difficult questions, specifically to test whether the stories about his wisdom were true. That's an outside witness, someone with no reason to flatter the biblical account, confirming that whatever Solomon had, it was famous enough to cross borders. This wasn't a private reputation confined to Israel. People far outside the story had heard about it and wanted to see it for themselves. So, by the middle of this chapter, you've already got two competing voices calling out to a young man walking through life. One is a father, speaking with love and worry, warning him away from a shortcut that only looks like gain. The other is a gang in an alley, promising fast riches with no mention of what it will cost him. Two ways. Every single proverb in the 29 chapters that follow this one, every warning about laziness, every proverb about a quick temper, every line about the company you keep is really just this same choice, dressed in different clothes, playing out over and over again. Here's the part nobody tells you, though. There's a third voice in this chapter, and she's the loudest one of all. Verse 20, "Wisdom crieth without, she uttereth her voice in the streets." This is our shouting woman Chokmah itself, wisdom personified as a woman who refuses to stay quiet, refuses to hide in a temple waiting for the right people to seek her out. She positions herself exactly where the noise is worst, the chief place of concourse, the openings of the gates, the busiest, loudest, most crowded intersection in the city, and she calls out, not whispers, cries. This detail matters more than it looks like it does. Wisdom, in the Bible, is never hoarded by an elite. She's not locked in a library for scholars. She's shouting in public, offering herself to anyone who will turn their head. And most people don't turn their head. That's the tragedy sitting right at the center of this passage. How long, ye simple ones, will ye love simplicity? And the scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge? She's not speaking to villains here. She's speaking to ordinary people, the simple, the easily distracted, the ones who love the comfortable, uncomplicated version of life more than they love the truth. That's most of us. Most days. You've walked past a warning before. You've had a notification you didn't open, a piece of advice you didn't take, a person who tried to tell you something true and inconvenient, and you kept scrolling. That's this scene, playing out in your pocket instead of a city gate. She doesn't just warn, though. She offers, "Turn you at my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit unto you. I will make known my words unto you." This is not a cold lecture. It's an invitation, held open, freely offered, no cost attached to anyone willing to stop walking and listen. Notice, too, where she is not standing. She is not tucked away inside a palace, waiting for kings and scholars to make an appointment. She is not behind a paywall, or a private membership, or a set of stairs only the privileged bother to climb. She has chosen the loudest, most public, most ordinary place available to her, because the wisdom this book is describing was never meant to be rationed out to an elite few. It is offered, first and loudest, to the crowd, to the merchant hauling goods through the gate, to the servant running an errand, to you, wherever you happen to be standing, when you hear her voice. But then the chapter turns. And this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because it lands directly on the moment we planted at the very beginning of this video. Because I have called and ye refused, I have stretched out my hand, and no man regarded. I also will laugh at your calamity, I will mock when your fear cometh. Then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. That is the voice from the street. That is the shouting woman we opened this video with. Except now you know exactly what she's warning. This is not God being cruel or petty. This is a description of what happens when a voice calls out for years, decades, an entire lifetime, and is consistently ignored. At some point, the door that was standing wide open closes not because wisdom stopped loving the person walking past her, but because the person spent every single opportunity walking past. You cannot demand an answer in the crisis if you spent every quiet, ordinary day before the crisis refusing to listen. This is not a threat. It's a description of consequence, stated as plainly as gravity. This is not a story about a distant, angry God waiting to punish people who make mistakes. This is not a scare tactic dressed up in poetry. This is not a chapter meant to make you afraid of wisdom herself. It is a description of what it actually costs to ignore the one voice out of all the noise in your life that was trying to save you. Job searched the mines and the ocean depths for wisdom and found nothing there. He asks the question twice, almost in despair, where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? And every source he checks comes back empty. It isn't buried in the ground where miners dig for silver. It isn't sitting at the bottom of the sea. Even death and destruction, Job says, have only heard rumors of it. And Job lands, after all that searching, on the exact same conclusion Solomon opens this book with: the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. Two men, in two different books, written in two very different situations, digging from opposite directions and hitting the same bedrock. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul would write something that reads almost like an answer to that search that Jesus Christ himself became, to those who believe, the wisdom of God. Not a wisdom you dig for, not a wisdom you earn through decades of study. A wisdom that shows up in a person, calling out in public, still being ignored by most of the people who walk past. If you read the Gospels with this chapter still in your ears, you start to notice the pattern repeating itself, a voice standing in crowded places, offering something free to anyone willing to stop and listen, and a crowd that mostly keeps walking anyway. So here is what we want you to walk away with. First, the fear of the Lord is not the opening line of a thread. It is the starting point every other kind of understanding in your life depends on. Get that foundation wrong, and everything you build on top of it will eventually crack, no matter how good it looks on the surface. Second, the voice trying to warn you, in your own life, rarely arrives with sirens attached. It usually sounds like an inconvenient truth from someone who loves you, or a quiet unease you'd rather scroll past than sit with. It rarely looks like a stranger in an alley promising easy money. More often it looks like a parent's warning you rolled your eyes at, or a friend who said the thing you didn't want to hear, or a quiet feeling in your own chest that you talked yourself out of. This chapter is telling you that the wise response is to actually stop and listen. Before the moment becomes a crisis that demands an answer, wisdom is no longer offering. Third, and this is the one that should stay with you, you are not too far gone, too busy, or too distracted to turn around today. The woman in the street is still calling. She has not given up her post at the gate. Verse 33 promises that whoever listens to her will dwell safely, quiet from fear of evil, undisturbed by the very calamity that swallows everyone who kept walking. The invitation in this chapter has not expired. It's still open, right now, wherever you happen to be standing. The only question this whole book is really asking, from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 31, is whether you're going to keep walking or finally stop and turn your head. Which voice do you think is loudest in your own life right now? The one calling you toward wisdom or the one calling you away from it? Tell me below. Because in the end, this is not just the opening chapter of an ancient book of sayings. It's the blueprint for every single page that follows it, planted in verse 7, repeated in chapter 9, and sealed shut in the very last line of chapter 31. Once you understand chapter 1, you don't just understand Proverbs. You understand why the whole book was written in the first place as one long, patient, unrelenting call for you to finally turn around.